all the way to the right is Jay Sheridan, who I've known for a long time through the PR industry, but Jay has whole other stories to tell about his community involvement as well. We appreciate that. And then Robin Hood, who I've always kind of been in awe of because he is a Pulitzer Prize winner. And so as a former journalist, anyone who has that distinction always makes me a little nervous. I'm going to be on my P's and Q's, I hope, a little bit. But Robin has recorded the history of Franklin for many, many years in photographs and other parts of the world and our state and country. And so we'll hear a little bit about that in a few minutes. But this book, tell me, Jay, the title of the book and how the book came about. What was the idea?
Well, the title is Historic Franklin Along the Harpeth, which, you know, Franklin sits in the bend of the Harpeth River, and it's always been sort of central to the development of the community and everything we do, and obviously a treasured asset, and so that fit, and Harlansdale fit on the cover. We felt like, because you know, we've made tremendous strides in preserving our historic structures, and obviously Main Street downtown and the neighborhoods, the factory, but we in the last decade or so we've made great strides in open space, but it felt like that was where the focus needed to be at this moment in time.
So you just thought, oh, I've got all this spare time on my hands, or was it during this particular period of time when we all seem to have a lot of spare time on our hands that the idea came forward?
That's exactly what happened. So I go back with Rod and Kay Heller to really the eastern flank. I was at a PR firm downtown, and we were helping with the golf course transition and all that stuff way back when. I guess that was probably 2004 or something like that. And so when the concept for the Harpeth Square came about, Rod asked me to help with the communication side, and so we were sort of involved in that project through all those years and 44 public meetings. And so when it came time to open the hotel, there were some construction delays and you know, typical stuff. And so we had a Christmas event with plans to do a big grand opening in the spring. And obviously in March, the pandemic started. And so in keeping in touch with Rod through that process, he wanted to do something as a memento to the investors, and that sort of started this conversation. Well, what if we did something that had group sales, you know, benefit, or you know, some sort of in-room value, or something beyond just a booklet that nobody'd ever see. And then we started digging into the east side of Main Street and how, you know, and that was I think it's fair to say that was a blighted area. But there was a ton of hospitality history on that side of town. The first tavern hotel was there, and you know, a dairy and a bakery, and lots of
a motel in the 1970s.
Absolutely, yeah. Jeff Bethurham's
Right
family.
next to the bookstore.
Right next to the bookstore.
When you say the east side, be more specific.
The east side of the square, really between First and Second Avenue.
Okay, first and third.
Well, yeah, you could go to third, but really, yeah, I guess that's right. I mean, the Baskin Robbins and the bank.
That's still on this side of the river.
Yes.
Yes, within the river.
Yeah, and so we sort of went down that path, and then at some point I said we need to get Robin involved. There's just no way we're going to be able to do this the way it needs to be done, and that morphed into where we are today, which is a more comprehensive history of Franklin. Robin and I had worked on several projects together over the years all over the country, and there's just nobody better, more talented, more creative, and knows how to do it right. And our designer, Jeff Carroll, is phenomenal, and so that was sort of the genesis of it, and then set into the research.
When Jay called you, how did you all decide to stay within the harbor. I mean, I think that's a very interesting, you called it, I'd call it the spine of Franklin, because I think if you look at it from an aerial map, you see that it really is the spine of our community, whether on the east or the west, north or south side of the river. Because it could be on the east or the west, or the north or the south, because there's we've got it all.
That was his original plan, was to stay between the square and the river. And, but we realized there was a much bigger story. Go back a few years, in 2010, I published a book for the Heritage Foundation called Historic Franklin. And several thousand copies over the years sold out. As a matter of fact, Joel at the bookstore, that's Old Tomlin Landmark Books, has complained for years that he didn't have a Franklin and wanted us to bring it back into print. Well, I'd originally planned perhaps to do that when Mary Pierce was the head of the Heritage Foundation, but then they had a big change there. But I still had at heart that I wanted to do an updated Historic Franklin book. So when he came to me, I realized that those two ideas could merge. Now, to help you understand, the title was originally Along the Harpeth, and then Historic Franklin was a subtitle. But somewhere in production, we decided that for name recognition, seeing it on a bookshelf, if visitors, tourists coming to town, Along the Harpeth wouldn't mean as much to them as Historic Franklin, as we changed the name. And to help you understand someone's question about the hospitality that they envisioned, that they talked about, that was in the eastern part of town. When Franklin was at the end of just a dirt road from Nashville, and it crossed on the old bridge near Bridge Street, came into town, that was a natural place for there to be the first hotel, White's Tavern and Inn there, which incidentally was built by the brother of the man that built the house that I live on Main Street. I found this out in doing this book. So you can live here. I've been in Franklin now for about 45 years from Chattanooga, and thought I knew everything to know about Franklin's history through my friendship with Rick Lord and a lot of other people. And there's so much I don't know, and I learned a great deal in doing this book. But back to the road, when they built the new bridge and the new Highway 31, all the tourists that came to Franklin, there were motels all between Brentwood and Franklin. But then they built one right next to where Landmark Bookstore is now, that parking lot for the bank. It was a big motel. And I believe there was another one out on Columbia. So that's the genesis of that story.
So, I used to think about when you would stand on the square and you would look to your right and you see 2 or 3 gorgeously preserved and restored blocks of Main Street. But you could look, as Jay was saying, you could look to the north and you would see an area that maybe had been forgotten or time had passed by. But this changed in the last 5 years with the Harpeth and other development going on the East Main Street side, the redevelopment of 231 Public Square. Did they make this more timely, just to make sure that was all captured as well?
I think probably so. I don't know that was conscious, but I think it is good timing. And what has occurred to me, even as you were saying it, is I've been here all my life, and I struggle to remember what that whole block looked like on East Main now. Mm-hmm. I have to really think about what was there, because it was so unremarkable, if you will. And then the struggle. Struggle's probably not the right word. The public discussion around something of the scale of Harpeth Square and whether that was a good idea or not. And I think we explored it fully and ultimately determined that it was. And I don't think there are a whole lot of people that would say that was a bad idea at this point in time.
Great idea.
So Jay, Jay and Robin, we'll get back to the book in a minute, but Jay, you said you're one of those unicorns, you're a native of this place. So what was it like to grow up in Franklin and Nashville in that time frame?
Well, for the record, I'm not a native. I was born in California. I moved here when I was 10 months old.
We've heard about that.
He's the first.
Right, I started the trip. I've been here for 46 years, and Started
He's a bad driver too.
right, but I don't honk.
Yeah.
No, I started in Franklin, grew up in kind of West Meade area of Nashville, but my mom had a design business on 4th Avenue and had a shop on Main Street in the 80s, and I went to BGA and had a bunch of friends down here. And so I spent as much time in Franklin as I did in Nashville. And it was a different place back then. I mean, you think about before Streetscape. I mean, there were, you know, you probably could have made an argument that Main Street was unremarkable at that point in time.
So I grew up in, just aside, I grew up in Nashville, and we'd come to Franklin to Carter's Court and go eat at Miss Daisy's, and we'd shop at the mall that was on the square. How cool was that? And then I got a job here in the early 80s, and my dad said to me, "Now, Mindy, are you sure that's safe? There's all those pool halls and liquor stores on the main street. Are you sure it's going to be safe?" So, Robin, what's your first memory when you came to Franklin?
Well, we live at the corner of 11th and Main, and I told my friend, when we first came here in 78, 79, I told my friends that I could go from my house all the way to Chattanooga without stopping at a single red light. There were no red lights, and the bridge up at the over the interstate was just a 2-lane bridge. The funny story, when I was in Chattanooga working on a book for Lamar Alexander, the first Tennesseans book that I did, and he asked me to come and join his staff, and so he had his real estate agent showing us houses on the weekend. My wife and I would drive up, and she was showing us houses in Belmead, Westmead, Green Hills, and everything. And so my wife happened to pick up one of these real estate rags. We were driving home. She was thumbing through. She saw our house, and she says, "Ask her about that when you go back." Came up every Monday for a meeting with Lamar's staff, and then we'd go out and photograph a certain town each week. So I asked her, I said, "What about this house?" And she says, "It's in Franklin. You don't live there. It's out in the country." And I said, "But we bought the house almost sight unseen, and glad we did now. But we've really enjoyed it." I want to go back a few years before you were first here. Your memories. I was talking with Joel Tomlin the other day about some of the historic buildings that are in this book, and they're going to be in another book we're doing, historic buildings of Williamson County. And Joel said that between the river and my house, and including my house, there were, during the Civil War and the Union occupation, there are only 8 structures remaining in Franklin today that were there during the Union occupation. I mean, if you can imagine, that's from 1st to 11th, where it is 11 blocks, and there are only 8 structures that remain from the Civil War era. And of course, that's the Joel's bookstore, the document files office, the courthouse, St. Paul's, a couple structures on West Main Street, and my house. I may have left out one, but
Wow.
Couple on Fair.
yeah, there were a couple on Fair Street, which Jim Crutchfield is in one of them. But Fair Street was just, people didn't buy the lots that were established in the Hinchyville new subdivision in the 1830s. They didn't buy them as quickly as they thought they would, and so a lot of them sat empty until after the war.
Oh, you mean they didn't develop every inch of Franklin back then? No, some people would say, that's one of the things we hear a little bit about today. So you came to Franklin, and but your career had started in Chattanooga. But did you set out to be a photographer?
No, I went to the University of Chattanooga and studied art, painting, and that's what I thought I was going to do until the draft board intervened. I went to Vietnam, and I became an information officer for First Air Cav there, and had a staff of writers and photographers that I would direct to do stories for AP and the Stars and Stripes and other publications. And so we had a pool of camera equipment that I also had to escort news media when they went out into the Cav AO area of operations. And so I started taking the camera with me, and basically that's how I learned. I was photographing the Montagnard people, the civilians in the countryside, South Vietnamese soldiers, American soldiers, whatever, scenery from the air, from the helicopter. And, you know, it just took hold, the immediacy of using a camera and seeing something and being able to capture it immediately, not have to sit and paint for 2 weeks, 3 weeks to get what you want. And so when I came back from Vietnam, I went to the newspaper in Chattanooga with this box of photos from Vietnam. They hired me as a photographer.
Wow.
So I haven't painted since.
Haven't painted since. That might be a loss. We might have to get you to take that back up. So tell us about your career in Chattanooga, the paper, and winning your Pulitzer through your career and coming to Frank.
Well, I'd been at the paper from when I came back from Vietnam, 71, and then came up here with Lamar in 79, so about 8 years. Into 77 was the year of the Pulitzer. You know, I started out low man on the totem pole when I first got there, and I was on the night shift, and we were photographing a lot of stand-up shots and that sort of thing. And
Can I ask you a question? Were you Banner or Tennessean, or were you working for AP? Who were you working for?
oh, this was Chattanooga News Free Press,
Right.
which was, and the other paper was the Chattanooga Times. It was the more liberal paper, and ours was the more conservative paper. And they photographed. They had twice as many photographers and twice as many. Their circulation eclipsed the Times by several thousands. Eventually, and they got a Sunday paper and started a Sunday paper while I was there, and used a lot of photographs, particularly color photographs. And so I got off the night shift to the day shift originally, but I was still doing the walk-a-thons and the skate-a-thons and the biggest vegetable. You know, I call myself a thon photographer after a while. But I became the assistant head of the photo department, and so I would assign people to do things on a certain shift. And Chattanooga had the biggest Armed Forces Day parade east of the Mississippi. Maybe in the whole country, but certainly east of the Mississippi. Every year, it went for miles and miles. And so I assigned photographers to different things, the reviewing stand, the floats, this and that, and assigned myself to photograph people standing in the crowd and their reaction to the parade. And this was in 74, I guess, and I came across two small Vietnamese children, a little boy and a little girl, waving American flags, and had a little Red Ryder raincoat or something. It was raining. And so I photographed them because it had been in the news a lot that we'd been relocating, local churches relocating Vietnamese families to the Chattanooga area. And so I said, wow, this is a great story. And I said, I have what I thought would be the page one photo. And then I went just not 50 feet further and photographed the African-American beard, real macho looking guy, muscular. He was sitting in a booty hat in a wheelchair. He was a double amputee, and he was sitting in a wheelchair. He was ex-Marine in Vietnam, lost his legs. And the rain was coming down. He was holding his small son, about a year and a half old, wrapped in his poncho to protect him from the rain. And he was watching the parade, and as this band went by, he was biting his lip and starting to cry. And this guy looked like a linebacker on an NFL team. And I said, wow. I mean, and this is a guy that, that paid the price for the Vietnamese kids I just photographed. And I could see page one, and I worked with the editor of the paper a lot. I could see these two photos being across from each other on page one. So I went in and processed the film as we did at night, and made my two selections, put them on the light table for him to see the next morning. Well, when I came in at about 10 the next day, and our deadline, we were afternoon paper, was noon. And so when I came in at about 10 the next morning, the city editor said, "Hey, Robin, great photo from the parade. We're running it on page one." And I said, "Oh, which one?" He said, "The little kids with the raincoats and the flags." I said, "What about the guy in the wheelchair?" He says, "Oh, we didn't have room for that." He said, "We got a wire photo and a President Ford campaigning up at UT Knoxville." And I said, "You're not going to run it?" And he said, "No." I said, "What about black and white?" And he says, "Well, we can run it inside as black and white, but we don't have time. You won't make deadline." I said, "I will." So I took the color slide, never done it before, but I went to the dark room and converted it to a piece of film, between glass, made a negative, dried it, made a quick print, took it out to him, still wet, I just squeegeed it, took it out to him, slapped it on his desk, I said, there you go, run it. He says, we'll get it in. It ran on page 3, below the fold, and they cut the wheels off the wheelchair. It was a little tiny thing. I just couldn't believe it. Well, I'm sorry it takes long to the story, but what happened was they had an open house a month later at the newspaper and wanted all the photographers to put up their favorite photograph in the hall, in front lobby, in big print. So I made a big print of that, the entire photo with the wheels and everything. Well, the head of the AP bureau for Tennessee had an office at the newspaper, had his own office there. He came in, he came up to me and he said, where's that photo been? Has it been in the paper? I said, you wouldn't have recognized it. Yeah, it's been in the paper. So he nominated it for the Pulitzer, and then when it won, it was in Life magazine and every newspaper in the country. But
That is
with all the wheels, on the wheelchair.
that is beautiful.
So Jay, do you pinch yourself sometimes when you get to work with Robin?
Yeah, I mean, it really,
Yeah,
really
right.
is a,
Or kick yourself, one or the other,
Yeah,
right?
that's like it, more like it, yeah. We've worked on some great projects together.
we really have, and you know, I went to school with Robin's daughter, and so always knew of him, and you know, one of those people you admire and never imagined you'd work with. And my path was, I went to journalism school at Ole Miss, and wasn't much of a student, but made my way through, and you know, 5+ years, and had some success in my degree was in magazine journalism, and had some success with that, and my path was either go to New York and try and pursue that, or come back here. Of course, there were no journalism jobs when I came back home, and so I ended up with a firm in downtown Nashville that was former journalists, and founded by former journalists, and that was a great experience for 6 years or so, and then ended up going to work with a former colleague there at a healthcare technology company in Franklin that didn't make it through the recession. So January of '09, with little babies and lots of bills, I was out in the street, and Robin was one of the first people I called. We had been on a board together, and he had, I think at that point, had let me be a part of the first historic Franklin book, or maybe that was one of the first things we worked on. But then he took me up to the Greenbrier Resort in West Virginia, and we ended up producing the Greenbrier magazine for several issues, and it just sort of went from there. I think the first book would have been Curb, I believe. So we did Mike Curb's 50-year biography of music, motorsports, and philanthropy, and that was probably a 2-year project. And
Big book acre.
yeah, it has a
380 pages or so.
300 entry discography in the middle of it, and then ended up doing some foundations and communities and universities and public prep schools and hotels. And so it's been a really wonderful journey with Robin.
How do you describe the style of this book? Some might just simply say, oh, it's a photo coffee table book, but it's a lot more than that, and it's a lot more in the other projects that you've done together and independently.
Yeah, let me precede before what he says. I've always had the belief as lifelong since Vietnam photographer, that if you do a book, and I've seen a lot of them that were just photographs, and I'd skim through them in the bookstore and maybe put them back, no matter how nice they were, and I realized that readers do the same thing. They may get all the way through the book, and they may not, but they don't spend that much time with it. A coffee table book, a photo book, needs a written word in it because it gives a certain spirit to the book to go with the photographs, and it makes people linger with the story longer. It becomes a more in-depth story than what you can see in the photographs. The photographs may describe a lot, but it's that written word that gives the details behind the story and the little bits of nuance.
Yeah, and I always, the corollary to that is I always joke that nobody reads the words, so they just flip through and look at the pictures. But some do. And so the first thing that I did was went and saw Rick Warwick, who we've all worked with for years. Rick had Bob Canaday's set of Williamson County Historical Journals. It was a complete 50-year set of those. And so pandemic, plenty of time. I went through and read all of those cover to cover and dog-eared and made notes and tried to start to figure out how you might, weave this story together. Because there's a lot to it, and there's so much information in there that really nobody's ever seen. I mean, the members have, but those aren't widely distributed. And you got to put some effort into reading them. The other key resource, Rick's books certainly were, other books that Rick has done, but Jim Crutchfield, who is another one of Robin's authors, did a book, I guess back in the 90s, maybe with Robert Holliday, and that was a tremendous resource.
Here's a bicentennial, so 1799.
99, yeah. So again, I mean, you got to really want to dive into history to read that book. It's more text with some, some black and white photos. So what we try to do is, break it up into these what we call sidebars, which are, the extended sort of 400-word vignettes of moments in time through that chapter, that period, and then extended cut lines, which are the underneath the photos, be able to convey some information so it's sort of a trick, to where you can get information across, and it's not in a 1,000 words. It's a short piece, if that makes sense.
So we'll talk a little bit about acquiring historic photos and how you did that and where they came from. But Robin, how did you set out to? I mean, I'm sure you have hundreds, thousands of images of Franklin, perhaps, and
Probably do.
But tell me how you called that and how you went out looking for what might be the new images in the book.
Well, serving on this project is more than just the photographer. As the publisher, we had several meetings early on with the Harpeth Associates and with Rod and Kay, and we outlined what this book would be, because this was morphing from what an early vision that Rod had into a much bigger project. And so anytime we do a book, we start to do brief paginations and outlines, and we brainstorm different themes and way we can present the story to the reader. And I always want the book and the story of the book is presented to the reader in a way that's easy for them to navigate. I mean, if they get lost in a myriad of details and photos and back and forth between eras, they don't stay with it that long. And so what we decided with this book was to divide it into the different eras of Franklin's history. The first chapter, there were 8 chapters or eras, if you will, and the first one had nothing to do with Franklin. It was America's western progression from the original colonies down to eastern Tennessee. And then the second dealt with coming from East Tennessee to Nashville. And then it was not until the third chapter that the people from Fort Nashville began spilling over the hills into northern Williamson County first, and then because of continuing Indian attacks around Nashville, it was not until I think about 98 that they came over the Holly Tree Gap. Some of the people from Nashville had been massacred at Holly Tree Gap just a year earlier. And so it was a year later before McEwen came over the gap and built a cabin where the golf course is now. And the cabin's still out there. They restored it. If you're not a golfer, they'll probably still give you a golf cart to go out and see it.
Vanderbilt Legends Golf Course.
Legends Golf Course.
And that's 1798, 1799 that he's talking about them coming over the Holly Tree Gap, which is on Franklin Road.
And this was just wild land. Franklin wasn't here. And obviously he settled that area because at the foot of Roper's Knob, the land was good. There was a Spencer Creek ran nearby. They were, I don't believe they were attacked by Indians at the time. We talked about Rick Warwick and all his knowledge and his great photo library. I mean, you know, you can go to Rick and say, I need a photo of this or that, or do you have, and he comes to you with more than you would ever use. But Rick is one of those people that, I mean, he's a county historian now, and he was a school teacher in East Tennessee when I was doing a book up, my first book up. He has such a knowledge of this county. I would ride down the roads out in the county with him, and I'd point out a house, and he could tell me who built it, who they were married, when it was built, who they were married to, who their children were, and what they did in the county after they left home, and where the family originally came from up in Virginia. And I mean, that's the absolute truth to a small town or farm in Virginia. He knew that whole history of that house. It wasn't just, oh, it was built by so-and-so in such and such a year. I mean, he has this in-depth knowledge, and it's fascinating to be around him to hear things.
So the book you mentioned by Jim Crutchfield and Bob Holliday, Franklin, Tennessee's Handsomest Town, is also out of print. As you mentioned, it ends kind of in the late 1990s. Is history, what's going to happen to the interim period of time between that book and this book in terms of recording history and keeping history available? Because you all were looking for photos and different things from those eras, right?
Yeah, a couple of thoughts. One, just fun fact, Rick's mother and my grandmother were best friends in East Tennessee. So we've always had that point of familiarity. But and another thought is that I could never be a historian like Rick because I can't remember all this stuff. You know, it really is an incredible skill to be able to retain all that information and recall it. So in terms of you know, yeah, I mean, we certainly endeavored to come to present time, which is you know, major moments like Harvest Square and 231 and you know, the Fuller story was something that really stuck out to me. Robin and I worked on The Unknown Soldier. That was another one of the things we worked on together, and we were on the Battlefield Preservation Commission. I think it was a task force back then. And I ultimately was on that for several years and chaired it through the sesquicentennial. And so there was a focus sort of in that time period about you know, how do we go beyond just the soldier's experience and talk about everybody else? I mean, you know, you're in a town where, you know, all the able-bodied men have left, and you know, you've got thousands of casualties, and you know, how do you even begin to clean up the mess and rebuild? And so there's the civilian experience and ultimately the freedmen's experience, and so the sesquicentennial sort of started that process of, if you remember, we had the banners of very few military people, a lot of other people that had important stories, and then now we've come to this point through all the national debate of something I think we should all be really proud of, which is adding more context, you know, to our square and community. So that was a really rewarding piece of the thing. But as it relates to you know, this between 99 and 2023, one of the things that was so notable was how hard it was to find photos, and even news archives. When the digital age emerged, you know, we all thought, well, it will be great to keep this on a little plastic, you know, disc. Well, then let's all put them on these CDs, and then let's put them on flash drives, and now none of those things will even fit in the computer. We couldn't find photos of the 2010 flood. I mean, they just don't exist out there, certainly in high res. And I'll call out Cassie. I think I saw Cassie back there. There she is. Because they were a tremendous help.
The Williamson Herald.
Yeah, which obviously you founded and had a huge part of. And a lot of, you know, those archives go back to your time. And I've sort of, you know, leaned on Cassie pretty hard to scour the archives and find everything they could, and also to say it's so important to preserve this stuff because we're not going to have the stacks of prints in our attic anymore to go back and sift through from our parents or certainly our kids won't. Yeah, how we preserve modern history, you know, in digital form, I don't know.
That's a great segue to the beneficiary of this book, and that really was a goal for Rod and Kay, but also so tell us about the fund for preservation of open space and how that's set up.
Yeah, so I've been involved with Friends of Franklin Parks really from pretty much the beginning. It was an idea that came out of my Leadership Franklin class. It wasn't my group, it was Adam Ballas's group. And again, this goes back to you, because when that organization was founded as a public-private partnership to be able to rally private resources to enhance public facilities and spaces in ways that wouldn't be possible with taxpayer dollars. Franklin Amaro took that organization under its wing and helped it grow and ultimately birthed it out into the world. And
Always with the idea it would become its own 501c3 because it was such an important part of what could be our future for our community.
but if you hadn't done that, who knows if that would have ever been possible. So
I mean, from the preservation, it's open space. So talk a little bit, we all feel like we have great parks and that,
Yeah.
but we need more, right?
yeah, and so you know, sort of, I'm the board president now, and so I'm partial to Friends of Franklin Parks, and true to form for the Hellers, they said, look, we don't want to make money on this thing. We just want to, you know, cover our costs, and you know, if you can find a way to make money on this book, then we would love for it to go to some important cause. And they obviously have been involved in a lot of battlefield preservation, but we advocated for Friends and for open space because it seems to be the most important issue, you know, one of the most important issues facing the community today.
And it's getting more difficult every year
Yeah,
here
it's
in
more
Franklin
expensive.
because every little postage stamp of property and land is so valuable and is being grabbed up by builders and developers that is the reason that we're growing. And you know, a lot of that is really good growth and attractive growth, but we've got a good historic zoning board at the city of Franklin and mayor and aldermen that respect the balance of our history and our need to make space available for newcomers that want to come and be lucky enough to live in Franklin. I wanted to say one thing about any book that we've done that is a history of a historic community or a historic site, a university or whatever. Most of our books start with a history of the organization, even historic hotels that we've done. What happens is the photos and the text and the happenings from the very founding of these places and sites is the most interesting. The old photographs and etchings and old maps, and as you go up through the 1800s and into the early 1920s, it still is fascinating to see the old photographs of things that you've never experienced. What is the challenge in a book that is about history is when you get into those last 20, 30 decades, because it's all familiar to you. You've seen it in magazines and newspapers in your lifetime, or you see it every day. So you've got to really dig a lot deeper in those last couple of chapters to find things that will hold the reader's interest. And it's difficult, very difficult to do, plus being met with the challenge of digital photography, which is great. I'm so happy for digital photography. I've been using it for 25 years. But so in the last chapter of this book, we put sidebars through the book. Those are little short stories with a photo that will tell a story. We did one on Robert Hicks, for instance, and the Will of the South, and his being instrumental in the Civil War Battlefield Trust and gaining velocity for that.
There's a sidebar on the Fuller story, for instance.
Is that the Fuller story?
Uh-huh.
On the
Okay,
Fuller
well,
story.
that's the one I was gonna mention, is the Fuller story. What a great way to, we don't always have that, but to include a more recent event in Franklin's history, it will be interesting. And the monument that they just put on the square and the signage and everything, to tell about, because there's an overwhelming amount of information, photos that are interesting about the Civil War. That's easy to get in Franklin. But now we've got the story of how the war affected African Americans that lived here at the time, and afterwards through Reconstruction and to today with a lot of the successful businessmen in Franklin that evolved from that. So that's a great part of it. And then one last little anecdote. You mentioned Rick Warwick being able to come up with all these photographs. I told Rick one day, we were working on another project, and I said, I've never been able to find a photograph of my house that wasn't made earlier than 1950, 1940. I think it was apartments at that time. There's a lady named Holtzhauser, some of you may know her, lived here in Franklin and owned that house. And there's a gentleman here tonight that said he lived there in one of the apartments when he was 1 year old. But that was great. But I said, Rick, I can't find any earlier photographs of my house, and that's so unusual because it was built in 1828. And so about a month later, Rick came by and he had this photograph in an old ragged cardboard border like they used to put them in, and it was the front of my house. And it was made in 1890s, which was Victorian times, and the trend then was to have colored trim. So they had taken, I know that it was green from research, but in the photograph it was a darker, different color. The trim on the columns, around the windows, on the corner boards of the house, the bottom board, they'd all painted it this dark green color as a contrast because that was the Victorian thing of the day. But what was really interesting was he had found this photograph in a trunk in the attic of Sam Fleming's old house on 3rd that they had given to EGA. And we're clearing out things in the attic as they were restoring it. And he found this photograph of my house and brought it to me. I said, wow, that's great. I said, well, who are these anonymous people on the porch? And it was because the photograph was made in the 1890s, and it was an older lady with long dress on the front steps, and standing next to her was a teenage girl in a long dress. And he says that young girl turned out to be the mother of Sam Fleming's wife. And that's why they had the picture in a trunk, lost in a trunk forever. And so now it's hanging on the wall in my front hall. And so things like that happen when you're dealing with history. And this is probably beside the point. And if you've got, I want to tell you one other thing. Of course, the other night at our event, we said that this book is by and large about the past, and we wanted it students and younger generations than all of us to be engaged by this story because it's the story of their past too, and then for them to be inspired to be stewards of Franklin's heritage for future generations to carry. So that's the effect that these books have. We don't realize it day to day until we see a park like Eastern Flame or Harlingsdale or historic signage. The history in our city, in our county, is all around us. I mean, you're walking over it every day and don't realize it. Certainly there are, like Perkins, Nicholas Perkins has a beautiful stone-lined cemetery over near Meeting of the Waters. It's back in the woods. You've got to find it. The DeGraffenreid family has one right off of 96 in Founders Point. It's a beautiful cemetery that Abram Murray and all of his family have. The beautiful headstones and monuments, well kept. The Crockett family, makers of rifles on Crockett Road and Wilson Pike. That house, Ford Seed, is there, and across the street is the Crockett Cemetery. Well, we can see those and we can see the monuments, but what we don't see, not all pioneers that died are buried in churchyard cemeteries are these stone wall, beautiful cemeteries. Not all soldiers that died are buried in military cemeteries within neat rows. Many of them, as we discovered in the unknown soldier that was uncovered on Columbia Pike during construction, there are literally, I would estimate there are thousands of Native Americans, of soldiers, of early pioneers, some way lost along the way, that are under the golf courses and the reservoirs and different places all over our county that we pass without knowing it. There are Indian mounds in the woods. Luckily, they preserve this one that's here at West Haven. There are a couple of Indian mounds out at the Meeting of the Waters on Natchez that you can see as you drive by. You can see the old, if you look, you can see the old stone bridge, Brown's Bridge, that they built for the Natchez Trace that used to go right by the original Natchez Trace before it climbed up on the hill, went right by there. And they built that bridge at the insistence of Andrew Jackson because for his troops that's where the city of Nashville came out to meet his troops when they came back from New Orleans. But you've got to remember that history is not just in a book, it's not just in a monument, it's not just in a park. It's all around you, and everything that we do today to change anything about the land or anything is in some way affecting that. Hillsborough Road, Fieldstone Farms, the big recreational ball field over there on the left. That was the site of a huge Indian town, and then a slight hillside across the street, because I went up there before they started building on that little hillside across Hillsborough Road, is a Native American cemetery, stone box graves. And they removed a lot of them. I'm sure they missed a lot, but you go up on that hillside to the blackberries and the stickers and all, and you could see where they had gone down and dug some of these up. The archaeologists explored some, so they had the stones in them. So it's everywhere.
And today is the history of tomorrow. And we've got to know that and record it,
Yeah.
I would guess. We've got a few minutes. Does anybody have a question they'd like to ask of these gentlemen? If not, Rob?
What's one thing you learned in the making of this book that was like, wow, I didn't know that?
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple of key revelations, and this probably goes back to the question about open space and where we are today and this initiative. One is that evolution is not only essential, but it's inevitable. I mean, that there was a time in Franklin when you were required by law to turn in squirrel scalps as a bounty, as a form of pest control. And so, these early pioneers came over Holly Tree Gap, and there were literally bears and wolves and panthers and native populations, and I mean it was a rough place. And then but there were tons of natural resources, so they carved out this place out of the wild and made a town. But so the evolution, we talk about all of these major milestones from I-65 to Cool Springs to the factory to Streetscape to where we are today. Something's going to happen. It's just a matter of what and how do we shape it into the best possible decision. And what I would say is that we have been very blessed to have great visionary leadership over time, and that was another big revelation. I said that the other night that I spent some time with Jeff Bethurham, who was the mayor during the Cool Springs decision and some other pivotal moments, and he passed away last week, but was took some withering fire through that whole discussion, and I think we would all agree that was the right decision. So evolution is inevitable, and it doesn't happen by accident. We've got to have great leadership and community engagement to make sure we make the best decision. And to the point of so we've launched this fund for the preservation of open spaces, which is public open spaces. because, you know, in the last decade or so, this is my opinion, but I think the organization shares it. We and others in the preservation realm have brought sort of, you know, token contributions to the city, and the city's figured out a way to make it work and do big things that are monumental things in open space preservation. I think the private sector needs to bring more to the table, and the stakes have never been higher. We've got all these development pressures. It costs a lot more. Growth means more infrastructure, means tax pressure. You know, all these factors are playing in to make the stakes higher than ever. And so that's the idea: is can we, you know, start the seed of an endowment over time? We can raise money and be able to, you know, work with the city and the Parks Department to expand parks and the trail system in a way that you know, gives the public more access to open space.
Right there.
So I appreciate what y'all have both done to really find and preserve and, you know, put into hard form the history that we all love and the things we don't know as well as the things we do. You mentioned the photographs and the difficulty with finding the photographs, especially the digital photographs, and then Rick being able to find the 1890s photographs in your house. So, you know, most of us are sitting here with thousands of photographs on our phone and our computer on the cloud, and we have a lot of those that we like to preserve for posterity. What's your advice about how do we do that? Do we print them, you know, what do we do?
I mean, printing was probably not a bad idea. You know, I mean, the only option now is either a hard drive or a putting it in the cloud, and the cloud seems like the safest place, but who knows? I mean, if the power goes out, you don't have a cloud anymore. So
A lot of people join Flickr or some other photo organization, and they'll catalog photographs. You become a member, and then you have photographs of, say, your subject is Franklin, and anybody can go through and scan and reach out to you for those photographs. And there are other photo organizations like that.
And I will also say that it's as simple as it used to be. You had to have a flatbed scanner, and it takes 5 minutes to do each one. I mean, you can literally take a picture with your phone now, just get down nice and tight and get a picture of it and put it in, you know, a Google Drive or Flickr or whatever.
You're talking about the old photographs, right?
Any photograph.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
You know, I mean, you can even just if you're just trying to preserve it so it doesn't go away, there's a pretty quick way to do that, and you know, have decent resolution.
I have 20 years of photography on a couple of hard drives. I don't trust just one. A couple of desktop hard drives, and then different subjects on small remote hard drives, all in my office and labeled. And then I have 20 years of slides in archival boxes and wire shelves in a storage room at my house that I don't know when I'll ever have time to have those scanned or go through and edit enough to have those scanned. But I suggest getting a desktop hard drive or a couple of hard drives, so you have in two places. This gentleman asked a question of what has changed. When I first came to Franklin, and first time I ever saw Franklin was in '79, starting the book for Lamar Alexander, and I said we did the Tennesseans, we did a chapter on different towns across the state, everywhere from Mountain City to Memphis, and Franklin was one of them. We selected those before we started the project with the governor's staff. When I drove out from that Monday morning meeting at the governor's office to do Franklin, and my writer that was with me, who was a reporter at the Free Press at the time, or had left the Free Press when I did to do this book, we both left. We're driving out Franklin Road in an RV, not knowing much about Franklin other than what the governor's staff told us that, you know, about it, the Civil War history and old homes and things. And so we're coming in Franklin Road in this RV and coming up the hill by Harlansdale, and we are looking at the horses on one side, and I glance over my shoulder, and it's Wyatt Hall, this house, Wyatt Hall, and it had a big Confederate flag hanging over the door. And told the writer, I said, well, there's a story there. So we got over the hill, turned around in the Harlansdale front lane and went back, drove in, and met Mrs. Wyatt, the first person, Margaret Wyatt, first person I ever met in Franklin. What a colorful character, you know, big yellow. Later, after her husband passed, I'd see her in town in this big yellow Cadillac convertible with horseshoes, spelling her initials on the front of the grill. Had a hat broader than the car, and with flowers all over. I mean, she was but when we met her, she was so gracious. She showed us the whole house, showed us, she had the doctor's chest that had amputated Hood's leg at Chickamauga. And her husband came out with a rifle that his ancestor had used during the Battle of Franklin. And we were overwhelmed. And she uttered this quote that made it into the book, that all a person needs in life is a copy of the Bible and a copy of Gone with the Wind. And she was an unreconstructed Southerner. And so we took her out and her husband out in front of the house with the Confederate flag in the background over them. And he was holding the rifle, she was holding Gone with the Wind. And we made a series of photographs. And so, you know, and then we went over and met Bill Harlan at Harlansdale and spent the rest of the day with him. And I've been back to Harlansdale, and since it's on the cover and he brought it up, Harlansdale's been special to me since that first day in '79 and meeting Bill Harlan, because I have shot hundreds of photographs at Harlansdale, many for books and many more for ads. I was doing advertising photography all over the country in the 80s and 90s. And so, you know, ad agencies would call me from Atlanta or New York or whatever. We did a series of ads for Disney for the new celebration that they were building down in Orlando, the big housing development like West Haven. But if they didn't have it built yet, they hadn't broken ground, but they wanted ad photos. So we shot all the ads on Main Street in Franklin, or on different houses in Franklin and out at Harlansdale. And so because Franklin's an all-American city, it filled a lot of advertising projects that we photographed for it.
Imagine we're out of time, huh?
We're about out of time. Do you want to say the books are available today for you to purchase, or they're available at Landmark Books, Harpeth Hotel? Where are the books available?
Tim Cottage, the Visitor Center.
Available right back here right now.
Russ has them.
And then, and you can buy them online at alongtheharpeth.com. We have the regular versions, and then we have there's a limited edition of 500 that are signed if that's of interest. And yeah, thank you all for being here.
If you buy one here, we'll sign it while you're here, and may even be able to talk the mayor into reading part of it for you.
Thank these gentlemen so much. Thank you for taking on a project like this. It started as one thing, and it obviously became something bigger, and we look forward to having time to spend looking at it and reading it. Not just looking at it, but reading it too. So I want to encourage you. Here's some of, we have a little flyer out on the table if you can pick one up about our upcoming events. Our next will be at Juneteenth this weekend in downtown Franklin. FRANKTALKS on July 10th, Breakfast with the Mayors July 25th, and then August 14th, FRANKTALKS. And I want to encourage you today, we were talking about the future. Today between 12 and 4, the Franklin Municipal Planning Commission and the Board of Mayor and Aldermen will be in a workshop on Envision Franklin and some aspects of that, which is our land use plan. They'll be talking about the factory, they'll be talking about housing, they'll be talking about open space and the future of development. It'll be available on Facebook or the city's cable channel.
At City Hall?
At City Hall from 12 to 4 today. But stay engaged, and then if you signed up for this program, and we have your email, even if you signed up today, we'll send you a link to participate in a deeper conversation with Jay and Robin and others about the Fund for Open Space Preservation and Friends of Franklin Parks and their work. That'll be a Zoom-only event on June 19th, and we'll send you the information to register for that. It is a Zoom-only event, and so we encourage you to, if you would like to learn more about Friends of Franklin Parks or the Fund for Open Space, to do that. And one more thing, Robin's looking at it, that's good. If you don't know, this is the historic Franklin license plate that you can purchase when you go to the county clerk's office to purchase your license plate. It's HF, Historic Franklin, FT, Franklin Tomorrow, Franklin, Tennessee. Franklin Tomorrow got this through the legislature almost 15 years, 15 years ago. And we would appreciate your support. And if you have one on your car, renew it, please. And if you don't have one on your car, consider getting one. But those were sold for the first time starting in July of several years ago when we got them through. So it's up time for renewal. But thanks so much. We hope to see you soon. And bye, book. Talk to these gentlemen. Thank you so much.